Spirit warriors know what their weapons are, how to use them, who their true enemy is, and they're prepared to give an answer for their faith, all to help others and themselves gain spiritual freedom. Spirit Warrior here. Welcome to episode number 11 of Unleashing Spirit Warriors, the show that is dedicated to sharing biblical truths and personal experiences in spiritual warfare and will teach you how to be for Him if you choose to do so. Anger. It can be a very powerful spiritual weapon, or it can destroy your life and those around you. It can also cause you to miss great opportunities for God. What makes you angry? Let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot of anger in the world today and a lot of reasons for it. Some of that anger is justified or a righteous anger and can be very powerful to make positive, godly changes in the world. Some of that anger is simply because people won't let go of something that happened to them and because they feel they're justified to be angry with the offender. A lot of the anger is not justified. It's more of a hatred anger and can destroy everyone and everything in its path. If you're harboring anger with someone and unwilling to forgive, you will not be effective for God, and you may very well be giving legal rights to the enemy or opening generational doors that can be passed on to your children and other family members. In this episode, I'm going to talk about a righteous or indignant anger and why that is so important if you're involved in spiritual warfare to any degree. I'm also going to talk about that fine line we have to walk before we get into hate anger and how that will destroy your life and those around you. Finally, I'm going to show you how even a mild frustration can keep you from being effective for God. What is meant by a righteous or indignant anger? Let's look at a few definitions and then we'll see what the Bible has to say about it. First, let's look at the definition of anger in general. Dictionary.com defines anger as a strong feeling of displeasure or belligerence aroused by a wrong, a wrath, or an ire. Now let's look at the word righteous. It says it's characterized by uprightness or morality, a righteous observance of the law, morally right or justifiable, a righteous indignation, acting in an upright, moral way, virtuous, a righteous and godly person. Now finally, let's look at the word indignation. It says it's a strong displeasure of something considered unjust, offensive, insulting, or base, and a righteous anger. Now, I did some research on blueletterbible.org for the word righteous anger, and only the New Living Translation had 2 verses even close to that. I also did a search on the word indignation, and I found 41 occurrences in the King James Version, 36 in the New King James Version, 28 in the New American Standard Bible. The thing to note here is that while the term righteous anger was not specifically found in the search, the word indignation is found multiple times, and based on the definitions we saw earlier, they're interchangeable. One thing we have to be careful about is to make sure we understand how the words are used in context. Matthew 21:12 through 15 tells us this. Then Jesus went into the temple and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of thieves." Then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out to him in the temple, saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. Why were they indignant? What was the source of this indignation? Well, first, let's look at the definition of indignant. Dictionary.com says indignant is a feeling characterized or expressed by displeasure at something considered unjust, offensive, insulting, or based. The book of Mark gives us a little more explanation as to why they were feeling indignant. Mark 11:15 through 17 tells us pretty much the same thing that Matthew did, but in verse 18 we can see a little different take on things. In verse 18 it says, "And the scribes and chief priests heard it and sought that they may destroy him, for they feared him because all the people were astonished at his teaching." This gives us a little better idea of where their indignant feelings were coming from. Was their indignation a righteous indignation? I'd say it was more of a self-righteous indignation, not a godly indignation. They were not concerned that the temple was supposed to be a house of prayer, and I would add healing, both spiritual and physical, based on what Jesus was doing there, or that the temple was used as a den of thieves to take advantage of people who couldn't bring sacrifices from long distances. Based on what Mark tells us, we can see that they were more offended or insulted because the people were not following them as much as they were astonished by Jesus and more interested in what he had to say. I can make a full episode on this passage about Jesus in the temple, turning over the tables, why he did it, why this was a den of thieves, and the things that go along with it. If you want to know more details about why Jesus did the things he did in the temple, I would encourage you to do your own research and dig into the details a little bit more to better understand what it all means. I go back to the question I asked earlier. What makes you angry today, and just how angry are you? Is your anger a godly, righteous, or indignant anger, like what Jesus said about his Father's house being a den of thieves? Is your anger a self-righteous anger like that of the scribes and the chief priests, or do you simply have a hate anger? There's a lot of things going on in the world today that will cause anger. Some of that is within our own individual lives, personal conflicts, and situations. Some of that is in our larger families, communities, or things going on across the country. Let's take a look at a few things going on in our world today that are causing a lot of anger. What about things like child abuse, child or human trafficking, drug or alcohol abuse that destroys the lives of our loved ones or those around us? Spousal abuse, divorce, broken relationships, or simply that person or company that takes advantage of you and takes all your money and life savings and leaves you devastated. How can you have a righteous anger about any of these kinds of things? In the case of child abuse, we know it's not the child that's the problem, but the abuser is. It's very easy to become angry or even hate the abuser and have great sympathy if you've ever experienced that kind of thing, or even to empathize for the children if you haven't had experience yourself. In order to have a righteous anger, you have to remove the abuser or the person from being the target of your anger. You need to make sure that the abuse and the things that are happening is the target of your anger. In episode 10, I talked about building prayer battle plans. Part of building those plans are identify the spiritual influences or demonic forces that may be affecting someone. If you haven't listened to that episode or episode number 9 on targeted and specific prayers, I would strongly encourage you to go back, as it'll help you understand what to focus on to change your anger into a righteous anger. Now, when you understand spiritual warfare, who the enemy is, how he operates, what his real goals are for everyone, you can begin to see that the abuser may be under some strong influence from the enemy. That influence may be from strongholds the enemy has had on them all their lives by telling them lies like, you're not loved, that no one cares about them, that unless you can be in total control of yourself and others, you will never be successful. That influence may also be just direct demonic influence from spirits such as anger, bitterness, hopelessness, self-loathing, hatred, depression, anxiety, or self-control, or a lack thereof. In many cases, you'll find these direct demonic influences are likely generational in nature, and if you know the family history of the person abusing, you'll find some similar things in their past, or that family members in earlier generations have been involved in occult practices. I've talked about how that at one time in my own life, I thought things like child abuse was a learned trait that was passed down to children who ended up being abusers themselves. While I still think there could be some truth in this, I think the bigger issue is not so much a learned trait that is passed on, but a demonic force that has entered the family line and stays in that family line until someone renounces those forces, breaks the legal rights and curses for themselves and all future generations. Now that you've shifted your focus from the abuser to the abuse itself and understand that the abuser is most likely under strong spiritual influence, you can properly channel your anger toward a more truly righteous or indignant anger. Your anger becomes more righteous because you understand that the abuse is against God's design for children, family, and that the enemy is trying to destroy the lives of the children or maybe even kill them or bring them to kill themselves or others because of the pain and despair they have. What happens when you focus on the person that's doing the abuse and not so much the abusive situation? Your anger most likely becomes a hatred anger for the person doing the abuse and not the abuse that's taken place. There's a fine line between having a righteous anger and a hate anger for someone, and I'll be the first to confess I've stepped over that line a time or two in my life. When you find yourself on the wrong side of that line, you need to confess it to God, ask for forgiveness, and get your focus back on the righteous anger so you can deal with the real problem. When you step into hate anger, it can have much bigger effects on you than you realize. Hate is a strong emotion that causes bitterness and anger along with mental and physical stress. You can find a lot of studies out there, both secular and Christian-based, on what prolonged hate and anger does to a person's mind and body. If you claim to be a believer but always harbor hate for a person or a group of people, unbelievers will see nothing different in you and will have no interest in having what you claim to have. If you have a prolonged hate for someone, you may want to check your own salvation and relationship with Christ. Something is not right in a case like that. 1 John 3:15 tells us, "Whosoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him." David Gazook in the Blue Letter Bible Commentary on 1 John 3:15 had this to say, "To live in practice of murder or to have a lifestyle of habitual hatred for our brethren is a demonstration that we don't have eternal life abiding in us and that we're not born again." So far, I've been focused on looking at all this from a third party observer position. But what if you're the victim of that abuse? You've been trafficked, facing divorce, or just had everything stolen from you. It's much harder to see things from a righteous or indignant anger position when those things have been happening to you because you're hurting, you're scared, you just don't know what to do, especially if abuser has threatened you if you talk to anyone. So what do? You have to understand that God loves and cares for you no matter what is going on, what has happened in your past, or what it may seem like. I'm sure you're asking the question, why would he allow things that you're going through when you've done nothing wrong? You must be willing to release your anger and hate for God. You must also be willing to release your anger and hate for the person abusing you and forgive them. If you recall in episode number 9, I talked about a relative that had a deep hate and anger for God because of bad things that had happened in her life. It wasn't until she was willing to release that anger and hate for God before God could really help her. After that, there was no question that things were different for her. She had evidence of a life changed, and the last few weeks of her life were the most peaceful, even though she still had a lot of pain and issues to deal with. I want to play a little clip from that episode as a little reminder of what happened that night. She told me she understood that, but couldn't turn to God because she hated him and was angry at him for the situation she was in and some other bad things that had happened to her in her life. She told me that she was afraid of going to God because she wasn't good enough for him and that he would never accept her. I told her that was not true and that God would accept her just the way that she is. After a few minutes more of talking with her, I asked her if she was willing to give up that anger, fear, and other things and turn it all over to God. She said she was ready, and at that time I'd asked the other believers in the room to come and pray with and for her. I asked her to tell God that she was sorry and that she didn't want to be angry with him anymore and she didn't hate him anymore. She actually had problems speaking the words, and I had to go back several times and try to get her to say them all to no avail. She physically could not speak those specific words. I asked everyone to stop praying and to back away from the bed for a few minutes. I prayed one of those specific prayers and asked God to remove any spirits that may be preventing her from speaking the words of her free will that she was trying to say. I commanded the enemy to remove his hold on her and to allow her to speak her free will decision to renounce her anger and hatred for God. I asked everyone to come back to the room and start praying again. Immediately after that, she was able to say the words that we were leading her in. There was still some struggle, but she spoke the words and renounced the anger and hatred. Then I asked her if she was ready to ask God into her life and to release that anger and hatred. She did ask God into her life that night. Once we were done praying with her, she said she felt better, but was still scared and didn't have full peace about things, so we prayed for that. About 30 minutes later, she was sleeping, which she'd not been able to do much in the days before. I can say for sure that there's spiritual warfare going on in that hospital room that night and the weeks before in my own life. She could not speak the words to renounce the anger and hatred until I specifically asked God to remove those spirits and commanded the ones preventing her from speaking. I'd been hit very hard in my spiritual life for about 3 to 4 weeks before we found out about her situation. You heard how my relative finally let go of her anger and hatred. You may have to do the same thing to release that anger and hatred for God and those who've wronged you. You'll find that the true enemy will do everything he can to stop you, so be prepared for that. You may even need to have someone there to help you fight the enemy like I did for my relatives that night. Now, if you've been a victim, are you willing to do the same? Ask God into your life, forgive those who've wronged you. There's a few things I need you to understand about that forgiveness of those who's wronged you. It doesn't mean that you have to become best friends with them or ever see them again, but you do need to release your anger and hate of them to God. Just like love, hate is a choice. You can choose to hang on to that hate and never become free from its effects, or you can release that hate and let God help you heal. Forgiving them of what they did doesn't let them go free. They must face the law and be punished accordingly. I've talked about the righteous or indignant anger and hate anger. In the beginning, I talked about how that righteous anger can be a powerful spiritual weapon and how that a hate anger can destroy your life and those around you. Why is that the case? Anger, righteous or hate, will cause a person to take action. When you understand spiritual warfare and have a righteous anger, you'll be moved by the things that go against God's design. You'll try to identify the spiritual forces that's driving the abuser and use those targeted and specific prayers to come against the enemy that is driving that abuser and try to stop the abuse, to get yourself free, and possibly even get the abuser free. Episodes 9 and 10, parts 1 and 2, will show you how to use those targeted and specific prayers. Episodes 4 through 8 will show you who the enemy is, how he operates in some cases. This will help you know how to respond with righteous anger. When you have a hate anger, you're always looking for revenge, how you can get even, make the abuser suffer in worse ways than you ever did. This will cause you to lash out and be bitter to those around you and may destroy relationships with those you care about the most. Being in a constant state of hatred can cause mental and physical issues in your body. Proverbs 17:22 gives us an example of this. It says, "A merry heart does good, like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones." David Gazook, in his Blue Letter Bible commentary on this, says, "A merry heart does good, like medicine." It's been said, no doubt based on this proverb, that laughter is the best medicine. Truly, a cheerful and merry heart is good for more than the personality, it's also good for the body. A broken spirit dries bones. Those who are defeated and broken in spirit will see the effect on their health and experience of life. It will feel to them that their life is withered and dried up. This was the feeling David described in Psalms 32, 1 through 4. Righteous anger and hate anger are choices that you make. I think Deuteronomy 30:19 could be a good paraphrase of this. It says, "I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live." To put it into the words of our discussion today, it may go like this: I call heaven and earth as witness against you today, that I've set before you a righteous anger and a hate anger, a blessing and a cursing. Therefore choose a righteous anger, that both you and your descendants may live. Before I close out today's episode, I also want to talk about how even a mild frustration in your life can cause you to miss a great opportunity for God. Obviously, if you have a righteous anger and are using that anger to go after the enemy and all the things he's doing against God and his ways, you can still be effective for God. If you have that hate anger, you're not going to be effective for God. Quite the opposite. You're going to drive people away from God because your actions will most likely be selfish and full of revenge. No one wants to be around people like that for very long. What about those non-angry, less intense, everyday frustrations and irritations we go through? Can that keep you from being effective for God? Absolutely. One of the things I've learned over time is when life gets crazy, from unusual job stresses, family issues, things that just break, unexpected expenses, maybe you're sick or just not feeling well for a while, I have found many times that those are the times when God wants to use me for something. When things like that start happening, I try to watch the people around me a little more closely, and I'm trying to be careful in how I respond to people. It's possible that the person who's just trying to start small talk with you, that you become short or unresponsive with, may be the one that God wanted you to talk to that day. Let me give you an example of this that recently happened to me. I had to take a vehicle in for a state inspection. This time I ended up having several problems that had to be addressed. Not a major deal, it's an older vehicle and things happen and just needed to be fixed. During the next week or so, I got those things fixed. I took the vehicle back a week later to get that inspection complete, and lo and behold, it failed again. The onboard computers were not registering things properly. Okay, 2 failures. This is getting to be a little frustrating, but hey, things happen. I'll get it looked into and bring it back the next week. The first 2 times I went in to get that inspection done, the place was not very busy, and they were able to get to it very quickly. The third time I was trying to get the vehicle back for inspection, things were happening that day, and I just couldn't deal with everything at the time. Yes, I was a bit frustrated before I got there. Not mad or angry, just frustrated with the fact that I had so many things going on that day and I couldn't seem to get anything done the way I needed to. When I got there, the place was swamped and I had to wait for a long time. My choices were to sit in a waiting room with a lot of other people or sit outside in a shaded area where it was really hot. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy being with people, but I was already frustrated with the day's events and I had to wait an hour or more for them to get to me. That just added to my frustration level, so I thought it was best that I just go outside with fewer people because honestly, I was not much in a people mood that day. I went outside and I sat there for a while reading some things on my phone, catching up with the news and things like that. And after a few minutes, someone there started an idle conversation and I finally started to engage with him a little, even though I really didn't feel like it. As we talked for a little while, he began telling me about something he was doing on the side. He was very passionate and excited about what he was doing. You could tell he enjoyed talking to people about it because he honestly felt that it could help others. And from what he showed me, I could see that it would be helpful to others. He talked about things, showed me pictures on his phone. And while I was interested in what he was telling me, there came a point where I just needed a break. I'll be honest, I was already frustrated and this was not helping my day. I really had to focus on not being rude and try to stay attentive. It wasn't his fault or anything he was doing. I was just having one of those days. Any other day, I would have been happy to just sit there and talk with him about things. Now, at one point in the conversation, he made a comment like, "In my religion, I believe, and that helps me and has changed my life." That got my attention and perked me up pretty quickly. I let him talk for a while about what he believed and why he believed it. I won't go into all the details of this person's religion or some of his beliefs here, but I listened intently and waited for the right moment to respond. The one thing I will say about this person, he believed in reincarnation, karma, and things like that. When I finally responded, I told him that I was glad to hear that his religion had helped him change his life and helped him treat people better. Then I told him I understood where he was coming from, but the Bible tells us that a person only gets one chance at life and is appointed to die one time, and then they're judged by God. No second chances. You don't get to come back and try and do better. I went on to explain to him how that I knew that there was one true God and that we have an enemy that wants to deceive us from turning to that one true God. I also explained to him a little more about that enemy, how he operates, and why he wants us to keep us from that truth. At one point, I explained that the enemy may have made things hard in his life for a while, introduced him to his religion, and then backed off to make him think that it was the religion that changed his life, while all the time it was just a battle tactic to deceive him and keep him from coming to the truth. I spent the next 20 or 30 minutes talking to him about a lot of things in the Bible, some common misconceptions, Christianity, apologetics in general, and things of that nature. At one point, he looked at me and he said something like, I can feel or sense that you're a really good person and that you really understand the things you're talking about. Without missing a beat, I told him, I'm not a good person. No one is really a good person. What you're sensing is me, is the Spirit of the one true God speaking to you through me. That had to be the Holy Spirit. There's no way I could have come up with a response like that on my own. He listened intently as I spoke about my experience with God, what God had done in my life, and the lives of those around me. They were finally done with my vehicle, and I think his came out soon right after. As I was leaving, he thanked me several times for talking with him, and that he was going to be giving a lot of thought to the things we talked about. This is a very good example of what I was talking about earlier. A time in my life when things were crazy and frustrating and just irritating at points. I could have very easily set off somewhere by myself or just not engaged with a person because I was having a bad day and I didn't want to deal with people. I may not have led him to Christ that day. That wasn't my job. My job was to do the best in a given situation and leave the results up to God. There's no question that I planted seeds that day, perhaps watered or nurtured some seeds that others had planted along the way as well. As you've heard me say on the podcast before, I may have been number 3 in a list of 10 good godly influences that person needed to hear before he turns to the one true God. So I ask you, have you had one of those days and maybe missed opportunities for God simply because your frustration levels were higher than normal, or you just didn't want to deal with people that day? We all have. The enemy will cause things to happen to stop us from doing what God may have for you to do that day. If that's happened to you, tell God that you're sorry that you weren't responsive when things like that happen. Ask Him to help you to be more alert and aware of those around you, especially in times when things are not going well, so that you don't miss the opportunity to plant seeds or even bring the harvest to that person who's ready to come to God. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Unleashing Spirit Warriors, and now you have a better understanding of how anger can be a very powerful spiritual tool when it's used properly, and how it can destroy you and those around you if it's not used properly. You can find out more about this adventure at unleashingspiritwarriors.com. There you'll find a link to this podcast, blog postings, links to other media sites, resources, and information on other medias, along with updates relative to this adventure. If you'd like to help support Unleash Other Spirit Warriors, you'll find a link to the support page there as well. If you've not already subscribed to this podcast, be sure to do so to receive notifications when new episodes are released, to help you win against the true enemy for others and to help yourselves gain spiritual freedom.
I've been running through the jungle with the line, line. Got me moving God's speed, I just slayed another giant. I ain't worried about my legacy. What's my execution? Never fear in the world.